Thank you, John. It's really a pleasure when you get to introduce someone that you have such a high regard for, as I do, Senator Lee. It makes the case or the job a little bit easier, too. I will say that much as well. We all admire somebody who stands on conviction, and sometimes we don't fully appreciate the price they have to pay in doing so. It's not always manifested in those great heroic moments, but really in the day-to-day battles they fight, those day-to-day battles of principle that they stand upon that guide their ideas and their beliefs. This same dedication to principle is what brings Mike Lee here today. It's somewhat of a politically unlikely destination, that is a conservative approach to criminal justice reform. To some, that's an oxymoron. To others, it's the embodiment of what it means to be a conservative, which is the rightful restraint of state power over the individual. The Heritage Foundation, through the Meese Legal Center and John Malcolm as director, has long supported reforms to address overcriminalization and is very pleased to host Senator Lee today. Now, Senator Lee is a graduate of Brigham Young University Law School and has served as Assistant U.S. Attorney, a clerk for Justice Samuel Alito. He was General Counsel of the Governor of Utah, and his father served as a Solicitor General under President Reagan. So, in other words, he has a deep appreciation for the implications of what it means to reform our criminal justice system. He doesn't come into this lightly. So with that, please join me in greeting and welcoming back Senator Mike Lee of Utah.
Brett, thanks so much. It's always great to be back at the Heritage Foundation. This place really is the heart of the conservative movement here in Washington, and I'm honored to be here with you today, as always. Applying timeless conservative principles to fix today's broken government policies and help all Americans in their pursuit of happiness has always been the bread and butter, at the very core of what the Heritage Foundation does, and what the Heritage Foundation does exceptionally well. It's how I've tried to approach my work in the Senate over the last 5 years. And it's what brings me here today to talk to you about criminal justice reform, an issue that has been of increasing importance to me and many others in the Senate and in the House. I'll never forget when I first began to appreciate the magnitude of this problem that we're going to be discussing today. It was in 2004. At the time, I was working in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Utah. In some cases, I witnessed judges being forced by federal law to impose punishments that simply did not fit the crime in question. First-time offenders, for example, sometimes being locked up for longer than some murderers and rapists. These were real people, people with children and spouses and dreams for a better life, and yet in too many cases, the so-called system that was supposed to correct their mistakes only seemed to compound them. This system wasn't just wasting money, it was wasting lives. So when I got to the Senate and was assigned to serve on the Judiciary Committee, I started looking for partners on the right and on the left who shared my concerns and shared also my commitment to achieving some degree of reform in this area. Now, until very recently, the progress was really slow. You see, sometimes it's not that easy to get people that excited about this issue here in Washington. But more and more today, more and more of late, from Capitol Hill to the campaign trail, support for criminal justice reform seems to be cropping up everywhere. All of the most serious candidates in the Republican presidential field have made statements or speeches supporting this reform effort in one way or another. Then there's the Democratic frontrunner, whose website boldly declares, quote, "We must reform our criminal justice system to ensure fairness and justice," close quote. Now, if you want to see this statement yourself, you can go to www.berniesanders.com. Now, I haven't checked this yet, but I'm pretty sure there's probably something very similar on Hillary Clinton's website. Or maybe it's just perhaps on a private server somewhere. And then Finally, last week, I was honored to stand with several of my Senate colleagues to announce the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act, which I'll be talking about in just a few minutes, and which may be the most important step forward on this issue in a generation. Yet again, I've managed to introduce a bill whose acronym isn't that easy to pronounce, sriracha, but it sounds a lot like that hot sauce that you get at some Asian restaurants. This bill, it represents the culmination of a lot of years of work by policymakers, by scholars, and with involvement from activists on both sides of the political aisle. Now, like most legislative compromises, this bill isn't perfect, but it is a great start, and it's a testament to the long overdue bipartisan momentum that is now building on this issue, and that I'm grateful is building. But I want to make clear, I'm not here to make the bipartisan case for criminal justice reform. I came to the Heritage Foundation today to make the conservative case for criminal justice reform, to discuss with you on our terms what's wrong with our criminal code and our penal system today, and to tell you what I think a conservative approach to policing and punishment ought to look like in the 21st century. Now, I realize that most people, including many conservatives, might think criminal justice reform is a progressive cause by its very nature, a progressive cause and not a conservative one. But this has never been true, and it's certainly not true today. The most successful criminal justice reformers in the 20th century advocated for what were ultimately, I believe, conservative goals. Law and order, built on the responsible use of government's coercive powers, tight-knit communities, a vibrant civil society, strong, intact families, and personal responsibility. These are all conservative ideals. Yet many on the right seem to have accepted the conventional wisdom, and as a result tend to be more skeptical than they ought to be about criminal justice reform. And in one sense, I can't blame them. Listening to some of the rhetoric on the left today, you'd think that our criminal laws and our penal system are not just in need of reform, but that they're fundamentally, if not intentionally, unjust and downright discriminatory. That even goes for some liberals who have been good partners in the movement for criminal justice reform. In a recent speech, President Obama spoke about the, quote, long history of inequity in the criminal justice system in America, as if to suggest that the problems today were no different than many of the problems that we faced in the past. And it's not just the left's sweeping indictment of our system that tends to be unappealing to us as conservatives. Many of the so-called reforms offered by progressives seem to be more concerned with lowering the incarceration rate than they are with lowering the actual crime rate. And it's the latter, of course, that we're most focused on and that we need always to have as our prize. But as criminal law scholar Stefanos Bibas put it, just because liberals are wrong does not mean that the status quo is right. Now think about it. When there's a major problem tearing at our economy and civil society, a problem that's been threatening our most vulnerable families and communities, conservatives don't just shrug and expect a bunch of outdated laws and bloated government bureaucracies to take care of the problem at issue. We know better. And in fact, we've seen firsthand what happens when conservatives decide to surrender an issue of this importance entirely to the left, just as we did for so many years on poverty, health care, and education. We know who paid the price for our failure to lead. The same struggling families, fraying communities, and at-risk kids who will continue to suffer if we do so again when it comes to criminal justice reform. If there is one thought I can leave with you today, it's this. Criminal justice reform doesn't call on conservatives to compromise on our principles, but rather to fight for them. It's about making our communities, the little platoons of service and cooperation that are at the heart, really, of our great republic, making those safe and prosperous and happy. It's about basing our laws, our court procedures, and our prison systems on a clear-eyed understanding of human nature, of man's predilection towards sin, and also of his capacity for redemption, along with an uncompromising commitment to the dignity of the human soul. Respectfully for the equal dignity of all human life, no matter how small or how weak, and for the redemptive capacity of all sinners, no matter how calloused, is the foundation for everything that we as conservatives stand for. Our approach to policing and punishment should be no different. So as I see it, criminal justice reform, properly understood, represents principled conservatism at its very best. For conservatives, the question isn't whether we punish those who break the law, but how we punish them. For how long, under what circumstances, and toward what end. Just as the government has the power to punish those who break the law, it has a corresponding duty to use its coercive powers responsibly, to sentence offenders to on an individualized basis, and on a basis that is no longer than necessary. You see, the real problem today is not simply that penalties are too harsh or sentences are categorically too long, though in many cases they happen to be. The problem is that over the last several decades, we've industrialized and bureaucratized our criminal, judicial, and penal systems, which is to say that we've turned a blind eye. We've turned them into large, unaccountable, short-sighted, self-interested institutions that often treat offenders as statistical units rather than as individual human beings. We have a criminal code that's so big that no one knows how many crimes are on the books. Not even the Congressional Research Service. And this is their job. The Congressional Research Service pays people to find things like this out. It pays people to go out and figure out answers to questions like those. They cannot answer the question. An increasing number of these criminal offenses are written not by legislators at the state level, but by bureaucrats in Washington. And far too often they're written without even a mens rea requirement, leaving law-abiding citizens guilty of crimes without intending to do anything wrong. We have federal sentencing laws that too often prohibit judges from exercising their human and their legal judgment while they're imposing punishment for offenders. And we have a penal system that isolates offenders from the only people and the only responsibilities in their lives that have the power to facilitate true rehabilitation and bring about redemption. So it's no wonder that an estimated 3/4 of offenders released from prison every year tend to be rearrested within just 5 years. Of course, for a lot of offenders, isolation from these vital sources of human and social capital began long before and may well have fueled their criminal activity, which is exactly why, for us as conservatives, criminal justice reform must be part of a broader agenda of opportunity and of mobility. That agenda has to expand access to the networks of opportunity within our free enterprise economy and institutions, our volunteer institutions of civil society, for all Americans, especially the most vulnerable and the most marginalized. Now, I want to be clear, this isn't an either-or proposition. It has to be all of the above. There are principled conservative policy responses reaching education, welfare, housing, transportation, health care, and beyond. For conservatism to serve the whole nation, it has to serve the whole person and fight for everyone that Washington's broken status quo is leaving behind. Restoring equal opportunity to all Americans depends on reforming America's judicial, policing, and penal system on the basis of human dignity. That goes for the victims of crime and their families, who are too often cut out of the process, for the neighborhoods that are denied the most basic safety that most of us take for granted, for the families especially for the young women and single moms who have to face every day without so many of their young men, whom they and their children and our entire society desperately need to live as husbands and fathers and anchors of their respective communities. And finally, for the perpetrators, who are, after all, no less human than the rest of us. For conservatives, the process of reform begins by recognizing not the mistakes of our past, but the successes, because the dysfunction that we see in today's status quo is more often the product of good intentions gone awry and sound policies grown old than the manifestation of historical or structural inequities. The case for reform cannot rest exclusively on statistics about incarceration. With more than 2 million Americans behind bars today, and 1 in every 28 American children with an incarcerated parent, the figures are truly startling. But this statistical part, really only tells half the story. Incarceration does not happen in a vacuum. It's a direct response to crime. So the reason we have an incarceration problem in America today is that for much of the second half of the 20th century, we had a major crime problem. Through good economic times and bad economic times, regardless of which party won the most recent election, and no matter how generous we made our welfare programs or how tough we made our criminal penalties, the scourge of violent and drug-related crime stubbornly persisted for 3 decades. Contrary to popular mythology, some of the strongest advocates of the stern penalties for heroin and crack cocaine in the 1970s and 80s were the primary victims of crime, residents of urban working-class communities who were the most directly and routinely threatened by the violence that grew out of widespread drug addiction and the corresponding family breakdown. But the combination of deterrence and incarceration was not the answer that many had hoped it would be. It was no categorical panacea. Even as the sentences became stiffer and incarceration rates rose, violent crime rates also continued to rise. And so all told, between 1960 and 1991, violent crime rates increased by a factor of 4, and homicide rates doubled across the country. This was no crime wave. It was a flood of lawlessness, of violence, compounded by an unprecedented and dangerous drug epidemic, one that left shattered families and frayed communities in its wake everywhere. And there was absolutely nothing that was inevitable about its retreat. Starting in the early 1990s, violent crime rates in America began to recede, a trend that continued for the next 20 years through the present day. This dramatic drop in crime was one of the greatest domestic triumphs of the post-World War II era in the United States. But it wasn't simply a function of locking up more offenders. In fact, we know from the experience of places like New York City that it's possible to reduce the crime rate and the incarceration rate at the same time. Reducing incarceration by reducing crime does, in fact, work if you do it right. Rather, it took a generation of iconoclastic reformers, conservatives, in fact, to finally stem the tide. And they did so by revolutionizing the nation's approach to policing and punishment. One of those iconoclasts was the theologian Michael Novak. Novak expressed the key insight of his reform-oriented generation when he wrote in 1986, quote, "What is amazing is not that human beings are sometimes criminal. What requires explanation is the fact that all are not. What requires explanation is virtue." Now, Novak's point was that criminal behavior is not a curiosity that requires complex theories to understand or explain. It is instead a natural feature of human life. It's part of our existence. And the only way to mitigate our innate inclination toward criminal behavior is to protect and promote our most reliable sources of virtue, where all of us throughout our lives learn, and when necessary, where we're forced to be honest, decent, kind, and conscientious. The most important of these character-forming institutions are family, faith, work, and community. The innovative policing and punishment reforms of the 80s and 90s, those that grew out of Novak's insight, succeeded precisely because they were designed to strengthen and increase access to these invaluable networks of trust and of opportunity. There was broken windows policing, the single most effective crime reduction policy of the era that helped rebuild fractured communities from the bottom up. And it was originally conceived by James Q. Wilson and George Kelling as they originally conceived broken windows policing. This broken windows policing was a collaborative project. It was called, it worked by calling on law enforcement officers and neighborhood residents to work together to maintain public order, and to do so by following local standards rather than rules imposed from above. This kind of order maintenance wasn't about maximizing arrests. It was instead about working together to reinforce what Wilson and Kelling called the informal control mechanisms of the community. These are all the little things that neighbors tend to do, to mind the gaps, to help each other out, to set expectations for everyone else to do the same. Together they form the connective tissue of tight-knit, safe communities. These informal social bonds, always anchored by the ultimate formal bond of marriage, are formed and strengthened through faith, family, work, and community. And they're corroded by violence and public disorder, which then in turn foster the conditions that themselves breed crime. Broken windows policing disrupted this negative feedback loop, this kind of downward spiral, reducing the frequency of criminal behavior. And it did so by repairing and supporting the homegrown social foundations of neighborhoods, especially those that had been hit the hardest by the violence and disorder unleashed by the drug epidemic. Then there was the growth of prison ministry efforts, inspired by the example of Chuck Colson, that catalyzed the rehabilitation and redemption of countless wounded souls languishing behind prison bars. Chuck Colson was, of course, formerly President Nixon's infamous hatchet man, but he became one of the most successful prison reform advocates in America and the founder of Prison Fellowship after his life took two unexpected turns. First, in 1973, he committed his life to Jesus Christ. The following year, he pled guilty to Watergate-related charges and ended up serving 7 months in prison. As he explained it, these two experiences, coming to know Christ and coming to know his fellow convicts, taught Colson that, quote, the solution to crime is no different from the solution to the human predicament as a whole. We are at odds with God. We cannot repair this situation ourselves. God has repaired it for us and offers us a part of that great eternal solution, close quote. Now, Colson had the credentials as a conservative, a born-again Christian, and eventually as a convicted felon, to live as a witness, teaching those on the outside about the indignities of prison life and inviting those on the inside to seek moral transformation through faith. Finally, starting in the late 1970s, there was a kind of proliferation of prison alternatives, like therapeutic communities, long-term residential treatment centers, and drug courts, all of which enabled offenders to stay connected to community, family, and work while serving out their court-imposed sentences. Studies estimate that nearly 3/4 of inmates were gainfully employed in the month prior to their arrest. And we know that a majority of prisoners are also parents, most of whom lived with their minor children before they were arrested or incarcerated. Yet the traditional penitentiary approach to punishment severs the offender's ties to family and to work life. Then, to make matters worse, prison doesn't just isolate offenders from networks of trust. It plugs them into networks of distrust. It takes them from a community of law-abiding citizens, where most people work and have families, to a community of convicted criminals, where idleness is the norm and families are separated, not just by walls and concrete and barbed wire, but often by hundreds, if not many thousands, of miles. That physical distance is often compounded by limited access to outrageously expensive phone calls home. In an era of FaceTime, texting, and ubiquitous telecommunications, this kind of isolation is as cruel as it is utterly unnecessary. By contrast, prison alternatives challenge the long-standing presumption in favor of incarceration and mitigate its most damaging and unhelpful consequences. This was a grassroots movement, often led by former inmates who knew firsthand the dysfunction of government-run or government-funded correctional institutions. And it succeeded where prisons so often fail, in preparing offenders to reintegrate into their communities as productive and law-abiding citizens, as spouses, parents, neighbors, and employees, instead of career criminals. This history shows that criminal justice can be, and in fact, traditionally it has been, a conservative project that accomplishes conservative goals. Goals of balancing retribution and rehabilitation, justice and mercy, the rights of victims and the rights of perpetrators. These same goals animate the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act, which my colleagues and I released earlier this week. Our bill expands federal judges' now limited discretion so they can treat offenders like human beings, not statistics, and punish them according to their particular circumstances. It broadens the federal safety valve, a provision that allows judges to sentence a limited number of offenders below the statutorily mandated minimum. Now, contrary to what many critics claim, this does not in any way absolve offenders of their crimes, nor will it suddenly and indiscriminately release legions of violent predators into our communities. Nothing like that. In fact, under this reform, the status of offenders with serious drug or violent convictions will not change. They will remain ineligible for federal safety valve relief. Finally, the bill improves the quality of our federal prisons by increasing access to vocational training, to therapeutic counseling, and reentry services, so that we have fewer first-time offenders turning into career criminals after their release. All of these common sense and long overdue reforms are on the table. They're all common sense and they're all long overdue, and they've all now been proposed. But make no mistake, we're at the beginning and not at the end of this generation's story on criminal justice reform. There's still work to be done if we truly want to rebuild the system according to the principle of human dignity and upon the proven successes of recent reforms that have occurred at the state level. There may be no better example of this, no better example to emulate than that of my home state of Utah, where judges are generally not bound by mandatory minimum sentences. While they still send many offenders to prison, Utah judges, in most cases, have fairly wide discretion to impose other sanctions. In some cases, smarter sanctions, in appropriate cases. And sometimes that includes sanctions on people like Paul Morris. Before Paul Morris was charged with aggravated robbery and assault, he was a successful salesman, earning close to six figures a year, every year, and he was also a proud husband and a father of a beautiful little girl. But he threw all of that away when he started using methamphetamine a few years ago. What began as experimental use eventually became habitual. Before long, Paul was addicted to meth and to petty theft, which is the quickest and easiest way to fund this addiction. Paul's story is the familiar downward spiral, one of his own making. It ended tragically in divorce, separation from his daughter, unemployment, a criminal conviction, and ultimately to one last choice: this one from a judge. Either go to prison or enroll in Odyssey House, a long-term residential treatment center in Salt Lake City. Now, as Paul tells it, this was a choice not of punishment, but of lives, between hopelessness and hope, criminality and change. He knew Odyssey House would be the more demanding and the more difficult option. Getting through prison is often a matter of survival, of simply serving time, waiting it out, letting it elapse, letting it pass. But Paul knew that there were only two ways to leave Odyssey House: dropping out, which would send him to prison, or changing his behavior. And with the help of a lengthy prison sentence hanging over his head, Paul knew he wanted to change. He had every reason to change. He wanted to get clean. He wanted to support his daughter and to recover the dignity and pride, the natural high of service-based success, available only through lawful, legitimate work. So he chose Odyssey House. And since moving in 10 months ago, Paul has flourished in this environment. Like most therapeutic communities, Odyssey House is essentially run by recovering addicts, those residing there. So everyone has to pitch in, not just to earn success, but to earn trust. After starting as a cook in the kitchen, Paul soon moved to a job with a higher profile and with additional responsibilities: supervisor of the department that receives, processes, and introduces new residents to Odyssey House. This role, along with the community setting for much of his counseling, has been critical to Paul's recovery. They're helping him learn or relearn those fundamental social skills and habits of the heart that are essential to being a member of a healthy community. Paul understands he still has a very long way to go in his recovery. He knows that whatever else happens, he'll always be a recovering drug addict, just as he'll always be a reformed offender. He knows that moral transformation is a life sentence, but with the tools provided by Odyssey House, it's the sentence he's pleading for. Reforming our federal laws so that judges have the option to send people like Paul to a place like Odyssey House doesn't mean we should avert our eyes from what he's done or from the crimes that he's committed, or to pretend like those crimes simply never occurred. Doesn't mean that we should make excuses that blame someone or something else for the choices that he made. Instead, it requires looking squarely at the facts of the case. No matter how ugly or how wicked, holding offenders directly and personally accountable for their crimes, and devising punishment, a type of punishment that's neither too lenient nor too harsh, that fits both the crime and the individual criminal. We do this all the time in our daily lives when we recognize the humanity of hating the sin and loving the sinner. It's called forgiveness. Forgiving is not the same thing as excusing, and it's not incompatible with punishment. Forgiveness requires assigning blame and, when necessary, imposing just punishment. Which is to say, forgiveness requires treating offenders not as blameless victims, but as morally responsible individuals, as human beings who, like the rest of us, have the propensity for vice and for virtue, and who must be held accountable for their choice of one or the other. Some crimes are so heinous, and some criminals are simply so monstrous, that the only responsible and fair use of the state's coercive powers is to prevent an offender from ever re-entering the society that he is so routinely or so violently, so thoroughly threatened. But the reality is that almost every offender who goes to prison will one day get out. We do ourselves a disservice when an offender's punishment does more to promote criminality than penitence. Forgiveness doesn't determine who is guilty or dictate what an offender's punishment should be. That's what police, juries, and judges are for. But real forgiveness also does not discriminate. As a matter of morality, I believe we're called not to forgive those who love us and forswear those who hurt us, but to accept that to be human is to be in need of forgiveness. And morality and religion aside, considered strictly as a matter of human nature and self-government, the pursuit of happiness depends on the opportunity to earn second chances. That's doubly true for Americans, trapped from youth in government-imposed dysfunction and inequality, who barely have one chance as it is. Treating our fellow citizens, our fellow passengers to the grave, as disposable is a price that's simply too high to pay for a society that truly believes that all lives matter. We know that no man is without sin. Now, we must remember in our hearts and in our laws that no man is without hope. This is why I'm involved, and this is why I'm here to invite you to join me in the conservative movement for criminal justice reform. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Lee. If you have a moment for a few questions, we can take them now. Sure. Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Senator Lee, what you say makes so much sense, but obviously things that make sense aren't always put into effect. Where do you see the big stumbling blocks coming? And I'm not saying they're working out between parties, but where does the opposition come for this plan?
Okay, so up until this point, the biggest source of opposition that worried me a lot related to the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, on which I serve. So Senator Grassley, who's the Judiciary Chairman, had some concerns with the predecessor bill, the Smarter Sentencing Act, which I introduced earlier this year with Senator Durbin. We've over the course of many months, we've been able to negotiate a new legislative proposal, a new bill that incorporates much, or depending on how you look at it, most of the reforms proposed in the Smarter Sentencing Act, and we put it into this new bill. And prior to that incorporation, prior to that compromise, we had gotten 13 out of the 20 members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Republicans and Democrats, to co-sponsor the legislation. But it had no chance of moving because Senator Grassley opposed it. But now that he's on board, and Senator Cornyn is on board, we've got not just a supermajority, but a super-duper majority of the members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. We'll be holding a hearing and then later a markup in the Judiciary Committee within just the next few weeks. So in the Senate, it's looking really good. Now, I will say there are still some, mostly Republicans, who still have some concerns. Most of those who are concerned with it are members who have not read it. When it's come up at our Republican conference meetings, our closed-door meetings among Republican senators, those who express concern, when they're expressing concern with the bill, usually I'll ask them, have you read the bill yet? And the answer is always no. After they read it, people always have a different reaction to it because and so the short answer to your question is the biggest opposition to it is the mistaken assumption that what we're trying to do is open the floodgates, that what we're trying to do is release all the prisoners, that what we're trying to do is wipe out all minimum mandatory sentences, and that's nowhere near the truth. What we're doing is really some relatively modest tweaking, but long overdue tweaking of existing minimum mandatory penalties, particularly as they relate to nonviolent drug offenders. Yep.
Shouldn't a distinction be made between the career and habitual criminal and ordinary people who fall into crime? And
Yes.
Isn't the importance for the career and habitual criminal to protect society quite properly? And on the case of ordinary citizens who fall into crime, shouldn't it be a matter of concern for the ordinary citizen?
Yes, and that's a great point, and that's exactly what this bill does. So by expanding the existing safety valve provision and creating an additional safety valve provision, we continue to focus on protecting society from habitual offenders, from violent offenders, from high-level offenders. And where we give the increased flexibility for the sentencing judge relates to the person who is generally not a high-level offender or a habitual recidivist offender, but somebody who is a relatively low-level courier or mule. And so that's where the focus remains. Yes?
Hi, I have a question. Thank you so much for your remarks. I work in the Meese Legal Center here, so we've been working on this issue for a long time. And I have a question regarding, you touched on briefly the vast explosion of criminal law. Last count, I think it was over 5,000 criminal laws, 3,000 criminal regulations. And I'm just curious, while I commend you for the sentencing part, does your bill that you've introduced include any mens rea reform? And if it doesn't, when do you think that should be taken up?
It doesn't, and it needs to be taken up soon. I think that needs to be the next big move in the area of criminal justice reform. And so for those of you who didn't hear all of what she said, or if you're not familiar with the term mens rea is the Latin term that refers to the intent element of a crime. In addition to the fact that we've got more crimes than even the Congressional Research Service can discern based on the federal code, based on the federal criminal code. We've also got a problem that many of these crimes are regulatory in nature. They've been put in place by executive branch bureaucrats rather than lawmakers. And in many, many cases, they don't have a mens rea requirement. In other words, you can commit a crime without knowing or recognizing that you were doing anything wrong, without intending to do the thing that is wrong. And so, yeah, this is a matter of great importance, and it's a matter that's long overdue, and I think it'll be the next big area that we tackle. But it is one of the problems that occurs. One of the concerns that I have had in all of this, we look at our federal prison population. It has exploded since 1980. It's increased between 800% and 900% over the last 35 years. This does not reflect an 8 or 9-fold increase in the commission of crime in America. It instead reflects the over-criminalization of the law generally, the over-federalization of criminal law, and in many cases it reflects the excessive use of sometimes excessive minimum mandatory penalties within the federal system. But anytime you have that much of a proliferation of criminal laws, you're going to have sloppy draftsmanship, especially when the draftsmanship is delegated to a third party, namely an executive branch agency that doesn't have a whole lot of concern for the needs of constituents or for pesky little things like due process and fairness. And so anyway, that's absolutely essential. Thank you very much.
Next year, you're up for re-election in Utah. Is there any concern that you may have a primary challenger who uses this as leverage, that Mike Lee is weak on crime? And if so, how would you respond to that kind of challenge?
Oh, well, look, no one can ever predict what challenges are going to come along, whether Democrats, Republicans, or otherwise. But if somebody wants to come along and use this as leverage for that, I'd welcome that opportunity to discuss this and welcome that person to read the legislation and to explain to me exactly what about it is soft on crime, exactly what about it would make us less safe rather than more safe, exactly what about it would make our criminal justice system anything other than more effective and more efficient in its operation for the American people. So the short answer to your question is no, that does not worry me.